All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to chapter 25. So, last chapter 24, remember we were talking about how World War II started, right? We looked at all the different tensions that led up to the war, both in the Pacific and in the European theater. All right, so chapter 25, we're going to take a look at how this war ends and what some of the effects are. So, to that end, we've got two different essay questions. Remember, chapter 24 and 25 essay questions are both going to be on there. So the first essay question is going to be, what strategies did the U.S. use to win World War II? Be sure to include specifics about the European and Pacific theaters. So make sure you're talking, again, how we tried to defeat the Nazis and how we tried to defeat the Japanese. Okay? And then the second essay question, what were the effects of World War II? Be sure to consider the effects on the British, the French, the Germans, us, the Japanese, right? All of those things. The Soviets you could throw in there too. So again, both those are going to be 12-point questions. So again, be thinking about those as you go through here. Okay, so first one. So remember, Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. We talked about that, chapter 24, a day that will live in infamy. That is when the United States decides we need to go to war to defend ourselves. All right, now the big problem is we did not have a very big military. Okay, so the big issue is, how are we going to get enough people to fight the war? So immediately we are going to have 5 million men that are going to volunteer. So that is a pretty hefty sum. On top of that, by the time the war is over, we will have drafted more than 10 million more soldiers on top of that. All right. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. This is a massive, massive mobilization of soldiers. All right. And keep in mind also, we aren't the only ones fighting. Right. So the Soviets, the Germans, the French, the British, right, all of the Australians, the Canadians, we don't think about them very often, but all of them are going to have millions of soldiers combined that are going to fight. Okay. The other thing is that as all of the soldiers in the United States, the male soldiers anyway, who are ready to fight, they're going to be shipped off to Europe immediately. So General George Marshall is going to create the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. Later on, there's going to be a Women's Auxiliary Air Corps as well. Basically, to have women take the jobs that men are going to leave behind that still need to get done, but weren't necessarily combat positions, right? So the auxiliary forces, these women, they are going to be, all the other stuff that military bases need: cooking, cleaning, maintaining equipment, flying soldiers, basically, to train. So there's going to be all kinds of female pilots, for example, that are going to be dropping paratroopers on their training flights and things like that. So that's a major change. Previously, all the wars we've talked about, remember, women are gonna work a ton, and they're gonna fill those gaps that men leave behind and do all of the other stuff that they were always doing anyway. But this is the first time where they're actually going to have a specific and paid role inside the military. So that's a significant change. Okay. Now, minority groups: 300,000 Mexican Americans are going to join. 1 million African Americans are going to serve in World War II. Keep in mind, though, they will be working inside segregated units. So again, last chapter we talked about the effects on minorities. So this is progress, but again, progress in America is slow, right? So yes, they're serving. They're going to fight with distinction, but they'll still be working largely in segregation. 13,000 Chinese Americans, 33,000 Japanese Americans, and 25,000 Native Americans. Native Americans, one of the most famous is Ira Hayes. Johnny Cash wrote a song about him. He is going to win the Medal of Honor, actually. Japanese Americans, it's interesting, too, because remember, we are at war with Japan. And actually, President Roosevelt is actually going to intern Japanese Americans in camps, basically, and take them away from their homes and businesses, because we view Japanese American citizens as threats. But still, 33,000 of them are going to volunteer to serve in World War II, which is kind of an interesting thing. Okay. This internment, you can watch this video. It's on the Chapter 25 video slideshow. You should take a look at it, because it is definitely a dark chapter in American history. Okay. The other big thing is, again, so our military is not big, right? Like the Nazis had spent all of the 1930s building up their military. We obviously didn't, because, depression. Okay. So how do we build up our military response and all that stuff that we're going to need to fight this war? Well, what the government is going to do, there's going to be a lot of volunteers. So a lot of factories are going to change quickly, but there's also going to be the federal government will step in and basically tell these companies what they need to do as well. Okay. So, car companies, for example, are going to start building airplane or like fighters and tanks and stuff like that, or they'll be building military vehicles instead of consumer vehicles. Um, you're going to have, guns that might be used for hunting. They're going to ramp up production and instead use them for, soldiers, obviously. All the stuff that's being produced for home, a lot of that is going to get, they're going to build up capacity. And again, they're going to be building that or sending that stuff over to overseas instead. Okay. And again, the industrial response in the United States is going to be huge. We are going to be the arsenal of democracy, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Without American industrial strength, World War II might have turned out quite a bit differently. Okay, so you're going to have 18 million workers are going to be cranking stuff out just for the war effort, 6 million of which are going to be women. You've probably seen the image of Rosie the Riveter. Keep in mind, she is the face of this, but there will be, again, 6 million women that are going to be taking the place of men that are going to go overseas to fight. 2 million minorities also are going to be hired. Remember, this is going to be part of that great migration that we've talked about in the past. They'll be facing a lot of discrimination. A. Philip Randolph will create a union called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, as an example, to fight that discrimination. Ultimately, African Americans and other minority groups will march on Washington, and FDR will actually issue an executive order forbidding, ethnic discrimination or racial discrimination in the workplace. This is significant in the move towards civil rights. Now, again, it takes a push to make FDR do it. But this is a change because remember in chapter 24, we talked about how FDR did not issue like a anti-lynching law or anything. So this again is like significant progress for African Americans and other minority groups in the United States. Okay. Scientists also are going to be mobilized from the beginning almost. The Manhattan Project will be working, and these are the best and brightest scientists in the United States. They'll be working on the Manhattan Project to develop an atomic bomb, utilizing this new technology basically that will be more powerful than any type of explosion the world had ever seen before. And ultimately, this is what's going to bring about an end to the war in Japan. Okay. Again, like I said earlier, the government is going to create the Office of Price Administration, the War Production Board, basically telling companies what needs to happen. This will be a marked change in how the role that the government plays in regulating the economy. This will be lots and lots of government control. Because again, if companies were allowed to we don't really want to do that, well, then a lot of this stuff just wouldn't get done. So FDR is going to definitely take control of a lot of these industries. Some of this is going to be an extension of what was already happening in with some of the New Deal programs, but this is going to go above and beyond that. There's going to be a massive, massive effort to conserve raw materials, just like we talked about back in World War I, where people are going to be like, remember all those propaganda posters we saw, right? Wheatless Monday or Wheatless Wednesdays, Meatless Mondays. It's going to be the same kind of stuff in World War II, but remember, we're going to be involved in the war much longer than a year in World War II. So it's going to be all of that stuff, times 11. Okay. So your first question then to answer in your notes, how did the United States mobilize and build up the military right after Pearl Harbor? Okay. So once we join, Winston Churchill, who is the United Kingdom Prime Minister, the United States is raring to go. We want to go attack Hitler directly. But FDR and Churchill talk about this, and basically there's a big issue. For one, Hitler's wolf packs are going to be pursuing Allied ships on the North Atlantic. Hundreds and hundreds of ships will be destroyed by 1942. So the Allies, again, just like we did in World War I, we're going to turn back to that convoy system. We're going to have massive groups of cargo ships that will be accompanied by destroyers with this new technology called sonar, and planes with the new technology called radar to detect these German U-boat wolf packs. And they are going to, really, really slow down the Nazis' efforts. So that's a very, very significant accomplishment. Again, no matter how much stuff we build, it doesn't matter if we can't get it to Europe where it's needed. And that is what these convoy ships are actually going to do. All right, so that's a really significant thing. There's a video actually about the wolf packs that you might want to check out if you're interested in this time period at all. It's kind of long, but it's worth it. Okay, So looking at Europe by the time that we join up in the war, right? So the Germans, again, here's Germany, here's Italy. Remember, these are your Axis powers, all right? But the Germans, by the time we joined, they had taken all of this stuff in the green and yellow, right? So they expanded. Obviously, they took France and the Low Countries. They took Norway. They took Finland. They had pushed all the way into the Soviet Union by 1942, right? Like they had made tons and tons of progress. They had controlled all of this stuff. And so the big question is like, where do we strike first? All right. And Winston Churchill, what he's going to convince the United States to do and the rest of the Allied powers is that like going directly into Europe, like in France, this is not the smart play. It seems like the easy play because it's close, right? We can mass all of our troops in Great Britain, throw them across the English Channel, boom, we're ready to go. But, don't you think the Nazis are going to be ready for that? Remember, France fell back in 1941, right? They had over a year to prepare their defenses all up and down the French coast, okay? So instead, what we decide that we're going to do is we're going to land down here in North Africa first, and then we're going to work our way across North Africa, and eventually we're going to jump across the Mediterranean, fight through Italy because Italy is basically collapsing because Mussolini was becoming less and less popular because he was kind of a joke. And this is going to do an important thing. For one, Italy was kind of known as the soft underbelly of Europe, is what Churchill called it. So if we can attack and open up a third front, meanwhile, the Soviets over here in the east, they're going to start pushing back against the Nazis and driving them back west. And then we could relaunch an invasion in France. And now the Germans would be fighting a three-front war. And that's the basic idea that you need to keep in mind, is that D-Day is going to come relatively late. It's not going to be until 1944. If you've played any like Call of Duty and stuff like that, any of the World War II video games, you already know this, right? You play campaign mode. Where do they drop you? They drop you in a desert. That's not a European desert. That is a North African desert. So they work their way across here into Tunisia. Then they're going to land also in Egypt, which was Allied control, to stop the attack on the Suez Canal. And then they're going to fight their way so that they can hop over here and then drive their way up through Italy. Okay? So, meanwhile, in the East, though, so if we can back up a little bit, so Hitler, by kind of the middle of 1941, remember the Soviet Union and Hitler had signed that non-aggression pact, right? And Germany does this not because necessarily they want to be buddies with the Soviets, remember. They were hoping to avoid a two-front war. Well, the thing is remember, the Nazis had like taken over all of Europe basically by the end of 1941 or the middle of 1941. And again, they're cocky, right? And part of the other issue that they're facing too is resources. They need stuff. And so what Hitler does is he kind of sees, down here in this Black Sea region, especially present day Ukraine, he sees this area as being vital because if you can control the Black Sea, again, that's shipping. And also there's tons of oil resources down here as well. So Hitler decides to kind of take his eye off the ball, and instead of abiding by this non-aggression pact, he thinks, because he's concerned that Stalin is going to attack him first, so Hitler goes on the offensive and launches what was known as Operation Barbarossa to invade the Soviet Union. Now, we've talked a couple times about like World War I, when the Germans invaded Russia, it didn't work out for them, right? It's cold. They get bogged down. Russia has a large population. They also have a dictator that can throw bodies at them, and those people can't complain. Otherwise, they'll get killed by their own government. So Hitler is going to get bogged down with this Soviet invasion. And this is a really, really important turning point because this is where Hitler, if he would have not done this, I mean, we can play the what if game all day, but if Hitler would not have invaded the Soviet Union, there's definitely a possibility that he could have like jumped across the English Channel and attacked Great Britain, right? It was a big, big error by the Nazis, okay? And in that winter of 41 into 42, this is going to be a brutal, brutal campaign. The Battle of Stalingrad. There's a video here that you can watch. There's a really, really cool movie called Enemy at the Gates that is all about the Battle of Stalingrad. You might want to check that out sometime on either Amazon Prime or Netflix. But over 230,000 Nazis are going to die. But look at the Soviet death toll. Over 1 million. That's insane. But ultimately, this is going to be a victory. The Battle of Stalingrad is going to